Okay, so Alan has also asked me to talk to you about the role of oral history in the context of local history. Oral history is important because it helps round out the story of the past. It provides a fuller, more accurate picture of the past by augmenting the information provided by public records, statistical data, photographs, maps, letters, diaries, and other historical materials. Eyewitnesses to events contribute varying viewpoints and perspectives that fill in the gaps in documented history, sometimes correcting or even contradicting the written record. Interviewers can ask questions left out of other records and can interview people whose stories have been untold or forgotten. At times, an interview may serve as the only source of information available about a certain place, event, or person. Traditional history usually only touches on the major events of the past, covering the fundamentals of who, what, when, where, and why. Oral history brings depth to our understanding of the past by carrying us into experience at an individual level. It also reveals what has changed and what has stayed the same over time. It's important to remember and record the past. Mind you, if I talk to young family members about what life was like when I was growing up, I'm likely to get the reaction, "Oh no, grandma's off again." But think about the changes that have happened in your lifetime. I grew up with an outside toilet very much like that one, up the backyard, and a chamber pot under the bed. The night cart man came and collected weekly. The house we lived in at that time had an old-fashioned black phone on the wall linked to a telephone exchange where telephonists could listen in to conversations. Not, of course, that they did. Later, we had a heavy black dial phone, rotary phone, which sat on a table, and then a series of phones of all sorts of colours, but still with a dial. The colour revolution was reflected in the pastel-coloured shirts my dad wore in the 1970s. And unfortunately, it's a black and white photo of him, so you can't see what colour shirt he had on. We listened to music on a record player or transistor radio, and later a cassette player or CD player. None of these are familiar to my grandchildren's generation, nor are floppy disks. We didn't have computers, let alone iPads and all those other devices that proliferate today, including camera phones. Language has changed. When I was growing up, bloody was the worst swear word you could say. Heaven forbid that you should call someone a bastard, and never a bloody bastard. Television came to Australia in 1956 and Hobart in 1960. My family had a small black and white television from about 1962 with 2 channels, the ABC and a commercial channel. Play School, Mr Squiggle with Miss Pat, and James Dibble reading the news. Each night at 7:30, the TV wished children a good night. A good night bedtime message, and it was off to bed. You imagine that now? In 1969, we watched the moon landing on a small black and white TV, a portable TV, in a large school hall. We didn't have a colour TV until about 1972, and even then you still had to change channels manually, no remote control. For my grandmothers, washing day was always Monday. Clothes were washed in a wood-fired copper with a separate mangle and were hung on wooden poles in the yard. My mother had an electric washing machine, but it still had a separate wringer. Her washing was hung on a Hills hoist. There were no dryers. Women of my grandmother's generation wore dresses with stockings and a hat if they went out, and possibly gloves. Always an apron in the house, and definitely no tattoos. Men of my grandfather's generation were rarely seen without a hat. Not many hats in here. Milk and bread were delivered to households, and there were no large supermarkets. Flavoured milk was provided at school at recess time, but often sat curdling in the sun beforehand. School, work, leisure, childhood, growing up, that wonderful old-fashioned word, courting, and marriage, family life, all these have changed. This is a bit of a bizarre story, but my mother's generation, and I don't know whether it was restricted to the town that we lived in, but before the women got married, they had all their teeth pulled so that their husbands didn't have to pay for the dentures. Has anyone else heard that story? Yeah, so in Tasmania? Yep. Lee? Here? In Tasmania? Yep. Yep. Yeah, so you didn't have an emergency, yeah. So I grew up in a country town. I had an aunt, uncle and 2 cousins next door, and a great aunt and uncle 2 doors down. I have 27 first cousins, most of whom lived within 3 blocks of our house. My grandchildren have 1 first cousin, and he lives overseas. So there's a huge change in family life in that respect. What do you remember about your grandparents? All 4 of my grandparents were descended from convicts, but this was never mentioned, and I doubt that they knew. Did you know your great-grandparents? What do you know about your parents' lives? Both my parents wanted to be teachers, but left school at 14 to help support their families. My dad vacuumed on Saturday mornings while Mum was at work, and he also made the best jam tarts. What do you remember about family get-togethers or celebrations? Have these changed? How did members of the family living in different places keep in touch? Has that changed? What did you have to do around the house? As a young girl, Mrs. Norris, who lived in Richmond near the bridge, had to whitewash the front steps of her house every Saturday morning. I interviewed Mrs. Norris, and she was really interesting. She left Richmond when she was 17, and one of the things that she got into very big trouble for was walking on the top of the Richmond Bridge while it was in flood. Think about the games you played, the toys you had, your playmates. Where did you play? Did anyone play here? Swam there, yeah, that's where the swimming place was, yeah. What did you do for entertainment? What did your parents do? Did you go to church as a child? Which religion or denomination? How often? How important was religion to you? What occupations existed when you were growing up that have since disappeared? I've put up the blacksmith, but there are things like typists who use typewriters, and I'm sure that you can think of other occupations that no longer exist. Were any of your family seriously ill when you were a child? What kind of help did they get? How did that affect your lives? Who remembers the local midwives in Richmond? They delivered the babies. Nobody. Okay. Do you remember, were any of your members of your family involved with a trade union or politics? Do you remember doing anything which could have got you into trouble with the police? No. Did you do anything that your parents would have disapproved of? No. How did you get about? There were certainly fewer cars. And meal times. There have been lots of changes around meal times and food. This is such a posed photo. It's nothing like a mealtime I've ever had. Yeah, that's the first thing I noticed, that he's pouring the tea. Family meals at regular times, sitting at the table. Meat and 3 veg. How have meals changed? Did food taste better when you were younger? Do you remember when you had your first spaghetti that didn't come out of a tin? Your first Chinese meal, your first piece of pizza, when women drank porphyry pearl. Some of you will remember that in 1997, I undertook a series of oral history interviews of Richmond residents or those who'd grown up in Richmond. Some are here tonight. Sadly, many of those I interviewed have since died, but the memories they shared remain on tape and in transcriptions. I also interviewed past and present members of the Richmond Volunteer Fire Brigade for another oral history project here. The Richmond oral history interviews provided a wealth of information not found in history books. It was an interesting exercise. Occasionally there would be differing versions of the same event, raising questions about the integrity of memory. We all remember things differently. My younger brothers, for example, have completely different memories of growing up in the same family. As the oldest child, my memories, of course, are the correct ones. But my mum would probably disagree. I once made a big song and dance about my great-aunt's car. My grandmother drove a blue Morris Minor, and I insisted that her sister also had the same model and colour car. I'd even driven in it, except she didn't ever have a car or even a licence. But I firmly believe that that was a true memory. In Richmond, I found out about ferrets, snakes and horses in pubs, umbrella-wielding football supporters, and a myriad of other aspects of life in an old agricultural town emerging as a heritage village, cultural centre and tourist destination. When I moved to Richmond in 1997, it was a picturesque colonial village with exotic trees such as elms, oaks and London plane trees and renovated heritage buildings. But it wasn't always that way. One long-time resident arrived in Richmond in 1948 when he was about 12. And he said, it was actually a bit of a culture shock. It was something like you would expect from some outback town on the mainland, I guess. There were very few sealed areas. There was a red-brown type of gravel everywhere, and being a very open sort of place, and not many trees and not much shelter between here and Colebrook, all the buildings were covered with this brown dust, and of course, not much painting had been done for a long time. Most of the buildings were in an aged condition. It was a bit of a time warp, really. It was just something out of another era. Another long-time resident who settled in Richmond in 1961 recalled that his first impressions of Richmond were that Richmond was a bit of a run-down backwater, a bit bare when I first came. Everything could have done with a bit of improvement. The houses, a lot of them were pretty run down. The place was pretty bleak. There were very few trees, for example, around the township. It was in this transition period when it had been a reasonably significant agricultural centre to a backwater. Gradually, the interest in Richmond was declining. When I came, nothing was happening, and then in the next 10 years, I guess, Suddenly people woke up to the significance of the Georgian architecture, and then it became quite a good thing to put your money in and do up the buildings. Another interviewee who came to Richmond as a child remembered that the town seemed full of old people, ancient ladies in black dresses, stooped with wrinkled faces. There were many stories about the two Richmond schools. It was not uncommon for children to work rather than go to school. One long-time resident recalled that Tony Burridge, son of trapper Punch Burridge, often went to help his father with the traps. Tony would come down past the school around the time we started school, and he'd sing out over the fence to the headmaster, "I won't be in this morning, I've got to go round the old man's traps, down around Lowlands." The headmaster would say, "That's all right, Tony, drop me a pair of rabbits as you come back." That's the way things were. The areas of policing and law enforcement also provided many memories. In a small rural community, the local police constable is an important figure. Trooper Cyril Williams was one of Richmond's most respected residents. He was legendary, and he was frequently mentioned by those interviewed. That was another thing that struck me when I first came here. When I came from Moona, the policemen were all dressed very properly there, with their helmets, etc. They were constables, of course. When I came out here, everybody referred to trooper, and it was a while before I understood what or who trooper was. Then I realised he was a policeman. It was a while before I realised why they called him trooper, and the reason was, of course, that he was a horse-mounted policeman originally. He ran his horse in the police paddock, but that was before my time. When I came here, so that's 1948, he was on a Harley Davidson with a sidecar. He did still wear the jodhpurs, which I suppose were appropriate for the motorbike, and I ultimately built his house. He was a great policeman, very highly respected, ruled this town with an absolute iron fist. He was also known for overlooking underage drinkers if they won the football game. He booted them out if they didn't. When Trooper Williams retired from the police force in 1959, he'd been in Richmond 34 years. The council established a memorial to him in the Rose Garden on the original village green near the bridge. The local pubs figured prominently in recollections, particularly the Bridge Hotel. Another night there was an old chap who used to be in the town here. Anyway, back in those times, 8-ball was the big go then, or darts. It was a cold night and we were out playing 8-ball in front of the big open fire in the lounge room. Old Neil was getting fairly well on. He was getting drunker and drunker. Most times it was nothing to be there 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. That was a regular thing. Anyway, he was pretty well full by this time, whatever time it was. He was having trouble hitting the balls, you see, and I said to my brother, "Where's those ferrets?" He said, "Out there." I said, "Go and bring them in." So he went and brought the 2 ferrets in, and while old Neil wasn't looking, we poked them down into one of the pockets in the table. They were down in there sneaking about very quietly, I suppose. Anyway, when this ball goes down in the hole and old Neil was just going to get it, this ferret puts its head up and looked at him, and he looked around at everyone. He sort of blinked his eyes. The ferret disappeared again, and he knocked the ball down again. Up comes the ferret straight out of his hole. Another Bridge Hotel identity was Jack Russell, and I really don't know whether that was his name or not. Jack, yep. He was in the old Bridge Hotel, and Pat Paramore, he was always a bit of a joker. He was working at Inverquarity, and he brought this snake in a brown paper bag, alive. He just twisted the top like that and he sat it on the bar, you see. He brought it for Jack's benefit. Jack's along there and he was watching this bag. Every now and then the bag would move, you see. He said to Pat, "What's in that bag?" He said, "A snake." He said, "Don't be bloody smart with me." Anyway, he had another couple of beers and he's watching the bag going like this. It went for about an hour and it eventually got the best of him. He said, "Snake be buggered." Well, Pat said, "You come and have a look." And of course he came along and slid straight up. He came along and undone the bag and tipped it out, and it was a snake. It slid straight along the bar and down on the lino floor, and it couldn't crawl and couldn't get going. Anyway, Pat, he put a broom on its head, he caught the snake and put it back in its bag. Old Jack's hair stood straight up. Sport was always an important part of life in Richmond. Staunch followers of the Richmond Football Club included one elderly woman who always took her blue and white umbrella to games. One interviewee remembered, "A little old lady with a black coat on, grey bun, no teeth, or perhaps one tooth, I think, and she used to belt all the footballers. If anyone beat our footballers, she used to beat them with an umbrella. And she had a string of adjectives that nobody else would even know how to say or even pronounce. She used to be an old devil at the football. She used to carry a rolled-up umbrella, and anybody who got a kick against any of her grandsons, because she had that many playing, so many grandsons, half the team, she would belt them. As they would come off, she would really belt them. She was a real old character, a real scream. We would go to the football just to see how she would react. Dances held in the town hall in the 1950s and 1960s were fondly remembered by several of those interviewed. Buses came from Hobart and hundreds attended. There were local musicians as well as dance bands like the Swingsters from Hobart, and homemade suppers were provided. Proceeds of the dances supported local groups including the Football Club, the Cricket Club, the three churches and the Richmond Red Cross. The dances were an important opportunity for young people to meet. Many well-known local couples met at the local dance. One interviewee commented, "We would go to the local dances every Saturday night, pictures every fortnight. There was a lot more social activity in the town than there is now. There were other social dances once a month that only the upper class went to." By 1961, the dances had begun to decline. There are many more stories that were shared as part of the Richmond Oral History Project, including about agricultural life, an important part of Richmond's history. I hope that this small selection of recollections will encourage you to share your memories. Oral history allows people to express the personal consequences of change. It enables people to share their stories in their own words, in their own voices, through their own understanding of what happened and why. With careful attention in preserving our sound recordings, the voices of our narrators will endure to speak for them when they are gone. Importantly, oral histories will help future historians avoid sweeping generalisations that stereotype people, engender prejudice and overlook important variables in the historical context. Finally, I want to acknowledge the outstanding pioneering oral history research undertaken from the 1970s by the late Peter MacFie of Dalcott. Much of Pete's work relates to the Richmond district and it's available online, and I've put a link up there on that slide and I hope you'll take time to read it. That's me done.